of displacement and migration in both rural and urban settings. He explores the idea that labor can be viewed as cultural production, resulting in an expanded social space. He's participated in exhibitions and artist residencies throughout the United States, Mexico, Central Asia, and India. Recent exhibitions include The Shape of Things to Come at Jadeite Gallery, New York City, Wheel of Fortune at Womb Space in Mexico City, and presentation at the 360 residency in Chapala, Mexico. He completed a 2021 summer residency with the NARS Foundation in Brooklyn, and in November 2021 he participated in a work in Sarajevo with Kuma International and Brodak Gallery dealing with memory, remembrance, and contemporary forms in memorialization. Pribich has produced art projects with the Public Works Department in Sacramento and Woodland, California. He's received a Pollock Krasner and a Fulbright Award recommendation.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Anne, for inviting me into this show. I'm really pleased to be in this exhibition with these other interesting artists. And Eliza, thank you for that presentation. That was, I had a lot of images coming to my head, just listening to those stories about your family crossing the Pyrenees and climbing in a box to cross a river. And it reminded me of this piece here. This piece is called Seven Beauties. I have another piece out in the hallway. It's the installation with the drawings. It's called Black Support. But this piece, it also has a rope. And this is why I was thinking that stuck in my head. This is a climbing rope. And this work is called Seven Beauties. It's about my mother's family in Mexico and their journey from Mexico to the United States, to Sacramento, where I grew up. And my mother's parents had 9 children. They had 2 or 3 others that did not survive, but they raised 9 children, including 7. I have 6 aunts, so that's the title, Seven Beauties. And with this work, I did it during the pandemic. Both works were done during the pandemic. And I was trying to use my family's history to look at Mexican history and New World history, Creolization history. And it's the first time I've done this. So the rope is like symbolic of my grandparents climbing into another world, another future, crossing the border and creating a new life and raising all these children. My grandfather was a cannery worker and a farm worker. So that's the symbolism of the rope is consistent with the story of their migration. And these are synthetic bags. They're used for different materials, rice, sugar, wheat, and also in construction they're used. And I use them a lot in my work because my work is very much informed by labor and the social conditions of labor. And bags are used on construction projects. They're used for lots of different things, and they're very resourceful. I mean, they remind me of the resourcefulness of workers to figure shit out and get jobs done, to complete their work. I'm always impressed by workers' ability to figure things out and get it done. I worked as an art handler a long time in New York, and we were always having to figure stuff out, you know, and that's just what workers do. They get their work done, and I'm always paying attention to that. I don't know why, but I just do. My father was an electrician, and when he was off work, with his buddies hanging out, they would just talk about work all the time. And as a kid, I was like, what the hell? Why would you talk about work? I mean, wouldn't you? But they did. They would just talk about work. You know, that was they owned that. That was their thing, and they always had something. I didn't understand it, but now I'm kind of obsessed with it in my own work in a different way. But workers inform my process, and the bags are an example of that because they're multifunctional. I can sew them together. They come in different shapes and sizes and colors, and they're everywhere. And I changed them with these buttons. The idea was to kind of like domesticate a raw material. So their buttons are called heirloom buttons. They're bone and shell, and that's what I was trying to do, is to take the bag material and change it and make it somehow domesticated, and because I can't really imagine how tough that had been on my grandparents or any immigrants. You know, I read immigration stories, migrant stories, like we all do, and they're just unbelievable. You know, they're just the grueling life, the grinding life that migration includes is beyond what I can imagine. But I try to remember it. I try to pay attention to it. So that's what this work is about. And it's the first time I actually made work about my family and using family to look at history. And the other thing that I'm grateful for in this exhibition is that I got to revisit these ideas. These are from 2 years ago, both works. And what I kind of kept coming back to was, and Elisa sort of touched on it also, the role of women. Christine Arson, her book called Mexican Nobodies, talks about the abnegation of women. And abnegation means this kind of self-denial. And I was thinking of my mother, who raised us and just spread love. My grandmother was just pure love, just love. But abnegation in Mexican history, like the Adelitas, who were part of the Mexican Revolution, they were the women that followed the soldiers. Some of the women had arms and had their own regiments, but generally they followed the soldiers. They were sex workers, they cooked, they provided medicine. They were a really important part of the revolution. And they are erased from history. They're not included in the stories about Mexican history. The soldiers in the revolution were given pensions. The Adelitas, I think they're called, were not. They were sort of put to the side, another kind of abnegation. So this is what is staying with me now, and just researching what I was preparing for today was thinking of this subject of how certain figures in history, women, and the other part of this show, the Afro-Mexican presence in Mexico, have been pushed to the side. And that just happens in history sometimes. And I was following up the danger of that, where a person's life is not valued. Sometimes people of color that are workers are dismissed because they just don't have, people don't value them enough. They're seen as invisible workers oftentimes. And the further danger is a complete disappearance, like women at the border or women near Indian reservations, native reservations in our country here. So I think this subject of tall tales and other truths is really an important one, because we need to resurface, reconnect with these stories that are not being told. And this Harriet Tubman monument in Newark is just fantastic. We need to have this recognition on a visual level in our everyday lives. So the other installation in the entrance, it's called Black Support. And about 2 years ago, I traveled to Mexico a lot to do work. I have a connection with a place in Jalisco, and I go there to be part of the residency, and sometimes I do a lot of work there that I don't anticipate. But 2 years ago, I was traveling to Mexico, and I found out somehow about this history of Afro-Mexicans in Veracruz. It happened around 1521. And I never knew this history. And I was flabbergasted on many levels. I thought, well, maybe our family has African ancestry from like 500 years ago that we don't know about. And then I was upset that I didn't know the history, that no one taught it to me. Like, my teachers didn't talk about the African presence in Mexico. My mother didn't tell me that. So I became obsessed with this subject, and that's what those drawings are. I did them in about a week. I got really involved in Africans in Mexico, and how I never knew this story. So those are, the images are, they're weight belts. It's another material that I use a lot. It's worn by laborers to support their torso when doing heavy lifting. They're called support belts. So that's what the title of the work, Black Support, acknowledging that time around 1521 when the slave ships arrived into Veracruz in the Caribbean. So I had this kind of urgency making those drawings. I was kind of pissed off, and I was kind of worked up about it. And that's one of the exciting things about being an artist, being able to research things and embrace new ideas. And that's what happened with that work. There's a African Mexican presence in Mexico, but it's not really acknowledged. They're in the Veracruz area and also down in Guerrero, which is down the bottom part of the country. The other part of that history, Mexico used to have what they call the case system. When the Spaniards, when it was initially colonized, the Spaniards initiated a case system, and they had names for people like Mestizo, Castigo, Zambo, Pardo. These elaborate it's like a scorecard of race based on color. So it's this kind of racist policy. And there's a lot of records of it because baptism, birth, baptism, and marriage documents all will describe the kind of person that it is based on these racial types. So that's part of the history, and that went on for centuries until a thing called mestizaje happened. In Mexico, because it's such a big country and such a diverse country, they were struggling with how to identify themselves. So this social system called mestizaje was initiated officially by the administration. It's called mestizaje, and the idea was that there would no longer be race in Mexico. And the idea was that European and indigenous blood would mix, and it would be the cosmic race. That was this very, very high-minded concept. And the problem with it is that it did not include Afro-Mexicans or natives that did not mix. It's a very racist idea because the premise was that Europeans' blood was elite and better, and it would eventually become the dominant blood of Mexico. So mestizaje is still in Mexico, and this history is kind of unknown still by many people. Don't know about the African history in Mexico. So that was part of what informed that work and what I learned after doing the work. Yeah.
You didn't mention the rebosos.
The rebosos they're emblematic of my aunts and my mom. They're symbolic of the shawls, yeah. And they're all the color brown, and they refer to different shades of brown that exist in general, but also they exist in my family. My mom is very dark, and my Aunt Tony is very light. So it's in my own family, these kind of gradations of mestizaje. Anybody else have a Arthur?
It's
Raymond.
Again, thank you. That was so rich and so beautiful and so moving. And again, you said this one thing that really got me, figuring stuff out. And that really interested me because I think sometimes we think of labor as toil.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this may lean towards a process question, but I'm curious about in your art practice that balance between the figuring stuff out,
Yeah.
and perhaps that meditative quality of you being a maker, like losing yourself in the process. I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
Sure, that's a good question. Figuring stuff out is like I was saying, I admire it when I see it in laborers and workers. They just figure stuff out, you know, with the whole goal of finishing the work and going home. You know, that's the goal. So that's kind of I'm inspired by that, you know. And all the materials I use, generally all the materials I use are connected to the idea in some way. The bags, the buttons, the rope, it's all, and that's how I work, you know. I think of process and idea together, materials, process, idea, materials, and process together. And it is a slow thing. It takes, I don't have I don't have a regular practice that I follow all the time. So it's an ongoing thing that I'm figuring out in my studio. Tools, materials, how to change something. What do I need to change something? What do I need to move something? Yeah, I think all of those, for me, those are all connected. They're all very, very connected. That process and idea. Max.
I have the advantage of knowing Michael's work pretty well. I've seen a lot of it over the past 10 years or so, and he employs a lot of different found kind of objects that have a real tactile presence. It's almost poetic the way he puts them together and situates them. And so that's something that you didn't speak to so much. You spoke about the idea behind the work, but there's also this poetic presence of just, even if you didn't know the idea, the work itself really has this power of just standing there. It's, wow, what is this thing? It's really beautiful, just a piece.
Oh, thank you.
That's something that you work with, right? I mean, this kind of poetry of material.
Yeah, you know, I have influences. Arte Povera is a big influence. Lots of influences. But that, like, time seems to be a big part of that. Like, allowing that poetry to come through. It's good to have an exhibition. It's good to have a deadline. But if I don't, then I just take the time. And it's always different. I don't have a standard process that I follow.
Yeah, if anybody gets a chance, it's good to see some of his other works for the context. It's
Thank you, Max.
fantastic.
So,
In the back.
I was just curious, a little bit more on the inspiration behind this piece, which you spoke about, basically, inspired by the women in your family.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, a lot of people tend to categorize, I don't want to categorize too much, but, Mexican culture as being more matriarchal.
Uh-huh.
And the importance of highlighting the presence of women in the, you know, in the family structure, but yet it's kind of like you said, there was this group of women that historically weren't even documented for the work that they did in society. So I was just curious to hear a little bit more about your inspiration. Like, were you wishing to highlight the work of women? Because it's also very work oriented, and you spoke about the work of men and how men spoke about their work, but the work that women were doing was like invisible work.
Yeah, invisible work, and I don't really sew. I had to kind of learn how to sew.
Oh, that's interesting.
And buttons. I didn't know what heirloom buttons were. I never knew what that was. Yeah, and sometimes a meditative, like all of us artists know this, when you have a repeated process, it can be meditative, and you can think about the subject or think about the ideas. And sometimes work is really nice that way because you just have this work, you know, you've already resolved it technically. You just have to do it. And while you're doing it, then you can process the content of the work or whatever.
So is this the first time you chose to engage in women's work? Like, you know what I'm saying, like to engross yourself in the process?
In this way?
Something that was considered traditional women's work.
I have some before, but not very much.
What did you learn from doing that work?
Oh, I learned the backstitch. I named a show in California. I did this show. Esperanza taught me how to do the backstitch, and it was large bags, really large, it was in Sacramento, my hometown, and I was studying the history of labor in Sacramento, and it's a horrible history of genocide of the natives and killing the soil. It's the agriculture center. I think I read that they grow the most rice in the world in the Sacramento Valley. So the backstage became like a metaphor for going back in history and kind of stirring things up and bringing it into the present. You know,
It's a very interesting process.
yeah, I mean, I love that when a process and a language can inform the future.
I'm wondering if you've shown this piece to your aunts and your mom and
No, I
what they
told
what
my
their
mom. She got
thought?
excited.
Oh.
I told my mom about it. And,
So they haven't, so no one's seen it?
no.
Okay, I'm curious what their reaction will be.
Yeah, I don't know why that hasn't happened yet, but it hasn't.
We left out the dyeing that you did, the materials.
Well, it wasn't real successful.
No, it is, I think it is. But I mean, I think that's part of it,
The color,
The
yeah.
dyeing.
Yeah, I was consciously trying to have brown little bolsos, brown shawls to reference skin tone. That is consciously.
Appreciate the work that you put into this. Appreciate the history that you're trying to tell that isn't told. Because not only Mexico, but you have Brazil, Venezuela,
Realize.
all have had, because of the Afghan diaspora, it went there first, and then moved North Caribbean and then further
Yeah.
into the North America. Argentina was, I think, the only one that actually wiped out, you know, the whole history. There's no,
They erased.
yeah, they erased everything.
More abnegation.
Right. But the other diaspora, and I wonder if you could speak on to that, not just the African diaspora, but we also had the migration that happened from the United States. It just didn't go north from the south into Canada, it also went into Mexico.
Yeah.
And so can you speak about that? Maybe that also influenced.
It's a problematic history, that one, because it includes the Buffalo Soldiers, and that's a very problematic history of our country, which pitted black soldiers against native settlers and laborers. Like Geronimo was hunted down by the Buffalo Soldiers, and they went into Mexico and sought out Pancho Villa during the revolution. It's a really fucked up history there. Real problematic. Yeah, I didn't know about it, you know. And then of course during slavery there was the migration of black people in this country going into Mexico to escape slavery, because slavery ended there around 1828 or 29. So it was like 30 years before this country. And you know, the conflict today, like in Brownsville last week when those people got kidnapped and killed, that terrible, I mean, after reading the history of the border, you can see this stuff is gonna happen, you know? I mean, this happened last week, but it also happened 100 years ago, you know? And 200, you know, a long time. It really is not changed. It's changed, obviously, but there's a lot of the same activities going on, a lot of the same violence.
Do you see the connection between the story that we were just told
Yes.
and your story, and how do you see the connection between this?
I love those connections. I mean, I think the migration, I think people should be able to travel wherever they want, whenever they want. I just believe that. I don't believe in these kind of borders. And reading, you know, I've been reading a lot of stuff in preparation for today, and in native cultures, there's several different words for this, but one of them is Napantla, and it's an Aztec word, and it has to do with like a fluid border, like a fluid space, like a liminal space that a person creates for themselves to deal with outside forces that are complicated. And what it does, it kind of a person can gain agency from a difficult situation. Gloria Anduzalo talked about Nepantla in her poetry, because she was talking about border theory and border politics. Like, her thing was acknowledging like the home country, for her it was Mexico, the border, and in California. She's like talking about living in 3 places all at the same time, like grounded, centered in 3 places all at once, and having that as like her center, where she like spiritually grounds herself. And that's, you know, pretty evolved. That's very evolved kind of presence on planet Earth. And I don't think it's just Mexico. I'm thinking, I don't know the words, but I'm sure that it exists in Syria and Palestine and, you know, other places in the world too. But I came across it in different contexts and different words for it, like this flexible interpretation of not reality, but like flexibility of place, you know, like creolization. You know, you're from Africa, but you're in Veracruz or Guadeloupe or Puerto Rico, or still that language is there, you know, like the person is there, but they're also in these other places, you know. It's really incredible. And I think it's something that we all should acknowledge more.
I'm sorry, we have to move on, but you're
Okay.
really, please ask your question when we're doing the panel, because I'm just watching the time.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. So let's shift the chairs more towards the center of the room. And you can take a couple minutes break if you want, and then we'll get started.